fantasy short stories.
Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 1, A Nude Beginning.
So, when you said you had a plan to get us out of here?
Atlas shifted, looking around the narrow confines of what looked to be a broom cupboard, filled with spare bed linens and extra cleaning supplies. He grimaced at one sheet that had a particularly gruesome brown stain on it.
I figured you had an actual plan.
He, the giant metal man, and the male dryad had crammed themselves into the closet with scarcely enough room to wiggle past one another. His attention was drawn to the swinging glass light that was causing the shadows to grow and shrink, playing tricks with the mind. He shook off their hypnotic dance and swiveled his good eye back to the dark-skinned man.
I've hidden under beds with more room than this. Why are we in here?
Scant on room to move, Lucas dug through the contents of his backpack, his fingers blindly rummaging through his belongings. They had ducked into what he thought to be the loo after escaping the infirmary ward. None of them wanted to be discovered by Ruby, with 2 guards and a personal assistant unconscious at their feet. Shifting through the extra sweaters and button-up shirts, Lucas found what he was looking for when his fingers gripped the edge of a coarse canvas material.
"This is just a hiccup,"
he chuckled to himself.
"I thought this door led to the Donnies. But no worries. There should be enough room in here for us to get in disguise."
He pulled free the fabric with a flourish, nearly knocking the Arcanist out in the process.
"Lucky for us, I already made a trip to the laundry room earlier this morning."
Atlas shied away from the Dryad's knuckles as they whizzed past his face, raising a brow as he did. What was unfurling before him looked like a cross between a boat sail and an oversized dress. It had frills near the shoulders and pockets in the front.
Are we supposed to walk out of here pretending to be the circus instead of in it?
Lucas squeezed past the Arcanist with a laugh and jumped, tossing an open loop of the dress over the large robot's tiny head.
"It's not for either of us."
He leaned around that barrel chest to cinch tight 2 straps, securing the largest apron ever sewn to the front of the machine.
"Ta-da! And just like that,"
he moved back to his spot, the grin on his face spreading.
"Our dented Metabot friend is now a harmless nurse."
Scratching at his eye patch for a long moment, Atlas could only respond by reaching up with his other hand to stop the dizzying swing of the light bulb.
Okay, I see what's going on here. This is actually a mental institution, and you're legitimately crazy.
He forced an obvious and fake smile on his face as he reached for the door.
Thanks for the rescue, friend, but I'll take it from here.
"Funny."
Lucas slapped the Arcanist's hand away from the door as he shuffled back to his bag. He bent over and pulled a second, much smaller white garment from the depths of his pack and shook out a wrinkled lab coat.
"I've seen other robots patrolling around the halls in aprons, helping doctors and nurses."
He wiggled the coat for emphasis.
"My plan is to head for the main doors under the guise of a doctor and his helpful assistant."
Hey, that's actually a good idea.
Atlas grinned as he leaned over, best he could, to rifle through the pack at the Dryad's feet.
So what's my disguise? A guard? A sexy nurse?
Lucas mirrored that wide grin with one of his own.
"You get to be the patient, and we're,"
he motioned between himself and the robot,
"escorting you outside for some fresh air."
Ugh!
Atlas straightened up, the noise of indignation falling from his mouth as he grabbed the open flaps of his medical gown. Cold air had been gracing his backside the entire time, and while he didn't mind the occasional breeze, he'd had enough. He extended his arms, all but exposing himself to the other 2 in the cramped room.
This is so degrading. I'm an Arcanist. I can't be seen wandering around the halls in something so unbecoming.
"The whole point is for you to not be recognized."
Lucas pinched the bridge of his nose.
And mate, you're rather limited on what you can actually wear.
He gestured to the large cast on the other man's leg with a pointed look.
Oh, no, you don't. I want to be the doctor.
Atlas finished hauling the medical gown off and shoved it at the dryad. He wrapped his fingers around the lab coat and snatched it away.
Come on, pony up the rest of the goods. I'll need your shirt and pants, too.
Lucas stared at that pasty, naked body for several seconds before he recoiled, shielding his eyes with his hands.
Oh, stop. It'll never work.
He pointed at the man's injured leg again.
That thing is just too big. It won't fit.
Then I'll make it fit.
Atlas began tugging the man's shirt upward over his head.
With a bit of effort and some elbow grease, we can squeeze it in there.
The door to the broom cupboard flew open, flooding the tiny space with sharp white light. Atlas turned to see a scandalized nurse glowering at him. She was an older woman, her leathery skin pulled tight around a face that told him she had spent most of her life sucking on lemons. Her hands moved from her hips to fold across her chest, while one of her pointed shoes tapped angrily at the tile floor.
What in the scholar's name is going on in here?
Buck naked and in the process of undressing another man, Atlas glanced down at himself, then back up. He forced his panic into swagger with a smile and wink.
There's room for one more.
Out!
She shouted, pointing angrily off to her left. Atlas grabbed hold of a mop, using it as a crutch, as the three of them shuffled from the supply closet. She slapped at them all repeatedly, even the robot, as she shooed them out into the hallway. She slammed shut the door and stormed off in a huff. Lowering his sweater back down over his body, Lucas's dark freckled skin was now a vibrant red.
Oh my God, I haven't been this embarrassed since my friends pantsed me at the beach when I was 12.
So what now, genius?
Atlas scoffed as he leaned against his mop. Unit 2 emitted a few garbled noises before offering the knapsack and stolen lab coat to the dryad. He then held out the balled-up medical gown to the Arcanist.
I agree with your robot. Let's just...
Lucas paused, pushing his arms through the sleeves of the white jacket.
Get our bearings and reset.
Swiping the balled-up medical gown, Atlas held it out in front of himself, using it to shield his nethers rather than actually donning the damned thing.
He's not my robot. He just keeps following me around.
He grumbled, looking up and down the hall.
But you're right. We should probably focus on escaping. I guarantee that nurse won't soon forget what she saw, and she'll come crawling back for...
Lucas shoved his finger against the Arcanist's mouth, shushing him as he suppressed a shudder. This was not how he wanted to start off his around-the-world vacation. He certainly had no intention of landing himself in a hospital, the sight and smell of the place forcing painful memories to resurface. Yet, here he was. And to make matters worse, in his attempts to find out where he was, or to simply leave, he had asked too many questions to the wrong people. He had been tossed into that locked ward, alongside the naked man currently standing next to him. He leaned around the hall, hoping for a break in the security guards mulling around the entrance, when his attention was pulled by the sound of raised voices. Lucas spotted the curmudgeonly nurse talking to a handful of soldiers, all of them wearing red or black uniforms, and she pointed in their direction.
Ah, bugger!
He spun, quietly ushering the others back the way they had come. They had nearly returned to the infirmary wing of the hospital when a high-pitched cry and stomping heels warned them someone was heading in their direction. Glancing wildly up and down the corridor, Lucas spotted an empty gurney and shoved Atlas towards it. He helped the naked man and his giant cast clamber atop it, and after shoving his pack beneath the covers, he flipped the end of the sheet up and over the Arcanist's face just as a terrifying figure stomped into view. Pulling his lab coat higher up around his neck, Lucas clamped his hand over Atlas's mouth and watched the woman in battle doll armor from earlier bound in their direction. She was not skipping this time, but stalking angrily as she hauled her whimpering servant behind her.
Madam Ruby, I...
The mousy man stumbled with each step, one hand pressed tight against the soaked-through bandages on his nose as she dragged him along, blood leaking from between his fingers.
I apologize. I was the one who was attacked. I didn't even see who it was.
His back turned towards the pair, Lucas watched from the corner of his eye as he pretended to be just another medical practitioner, flipping idly through blank pages attached to a clipboard. He watched as Ruby shoved her sniveling assistant against the wall, sliding him upwards until his feet were dangling uselessly. She held him there, threatening him with angry, one-handed sign language. Her gestures were half-assed, like she had started to learn but never finished. He could understand the gist of it, and despite the smile on her face, her words were horrifying.
Beating your translator will not return the Arcanist to us.
A third figure walked into view. This one, an impossibly tall man dressed in simple black robes. But the ornate golden mask that covered his face set every nerve in Lucas's body on edge. This, he assumed, must be the scholar. With a roll of her eyes, Ruby let the man drop. He crumpled to the ground, gasping as he bent to kiss the tops of her feet.
Thank you, madam.
She sneered down at those words and kicked him before turning back to the masked man and making several angry gestures. The scholar held up a hand.
I know that you are frustrated. We will find the Arcanist or another way into the infernal realm. But right now, there are bigger issues to deal with. The prince has been spotted, meaning Chester will soon mobilize his troops. We need to prepare to seal off the city.
Ruby slammed her tiny armored fist into the concrete wall, and it cratered inward, the cracks webbing out to touch the ceiling. Small bits of shrapnel and debris clattered to the tile floor, causing a nearby doctor to jump and drop his clipboard. She tilted her head towards him, noticing the dark-skinned man for the first time. Fumbling, Lucas snatched it back up as fast as he could and thrust the file towards the apron-clad robot.
Oh, why, yes, Miss Johnston. I think you're right. This man is suffering from bread poisoning. We should prep him for surgery immediately.
The robot's left eye blinked once before he began wheeling the gurney in the opposite direction. Lucas attempted to follow, but a firm grip on his shoulder nearly floored him. He was spun around and forced to meet those dangerous green eyes. Ruby's gaze bore into him. He felt as if she was dissecting his soul and reading every lie he had ever told. He swallowed hard. The disguise had failed. Beads of sweat built up on Lucas's forehead, and his shaking hand moved instinctively to his chest, gripping at something beneath his shirt. He managed to choke out the word,
Yes?
She didn't acknowledge him, but instead shoved him towards her cowering assistant. She pointed at her own nose, then at the blubbering man, and mimicked wrapping a bandage around an imaginary head. Lucas had barely sucked down a breath before she spun and marched off down the hall, the scholar gliding elegantly behind her. He looked down at that mousy man, blood still pouring from beneath that heavily bandaged nose, and relaxed. He was going to need a lot of gauze, luck, and perhaps a fresh pair of boxers. Eric was warm. Too warm. The fires of damnation felt an awful lot like cooking beneath several heavy blankets. It was stifling, causing him to squirm in a fit, but his body wouldn't move. His head ached, there was a rushing sound in his ears, and his eyelids refused to break open. Through the haze that clouded his mind, he recalled snow, the icy flakes burning his skin, and his inevitable collapse. So he was dead, and this really was the afterlife. He struggled again, but felt as though he were buried beneath a mountain, and he moaned in pain. "Whoa there, not so fast. It's best you don't move around much." He felt a hand press down on his forehead, forcing him to remain still in what felt like a bed of stiff linens and furs. Wait, a hand? Blankets? Eric finally managed to pry open his right eye, his left one still somewhat swollen, and gentle, flickering candlelight filtered in through his sticky lashes. He was inside a cozy, leather-hide dwelling. The oversized tent was filled with furs and blankets, rations and clothing hanging on lines that surrounded a small potbelly stove. The smoke pipe shot up and out through the pitched ceiling, and the fire it held within crackled happily. He was alive. Eric attempted to sit up once more, but his body felt as though it were compressed between the teeth of a vice. It was heavy and warm, suffocating him with pressure to the point he could only take in shallow breaths. He moved his eye down. It wasn't a restraint or a mountain, well, not a stone one. Sitting atop him was a truly massive black and white dog, a husky the size of a polar bear. When he attempted to move again, the dog shifted its weight to lean over and smother his face in wet kisses. The assault left the smell of tuna in his nostrils, and he gagged, coughing as a fresh wave of agony ripped through his skull.
"What happened?"
Eric's voice was cracked and dry, as if he had somehow forgotten how to use it.
"Now that's a story, innit?"
Swiveling his good eye around the room, Eric's gaze landed on a figure sitting on the floor near the potbelly stove. His skin was pale, dappled with spots of pink vitiligo, and his white braided hair was pulled back into a bun on his head. He had briefly heard of the Northern Selkies, even masqueraded around as one for a time, but never had the chance to meet one personally.
"Imagine my surprise, eh? I go berry picking and come back with a half-elf popsicle."
The man chortled to himself as he shoved another log into the stove.
"I said to myself, Self, you can't just leave a man out here in the storms to die. So I tossed you onto my sled and brought you back to my humble abode."
He waved a hand at his surroundings. He then pulled himself along the ground until he was close enough to replace the damp cloth on the other man's forehead with a dry one.
"My name is Indiga, and I'm glad you survived."
Eric wanted to sit up, but was afraid of another onslaught of smelly kisses from the dog.
How long was I out?
The man clicked his tongue and said in a leading voice,
"Hello, Indiga. Thank you for saving me. My name is..."
Eric. My name is Eric.
He scowled. This was hardly the time to stand on ceremony.
Thank you for saving me. Now, how long have I been out?
The emphasis on the last words tossed him into another coughing fit. Indiga belted out a bark of laughter.
"Nice to meet you, Eric."
He scratched at his head, digging a finger just underneath the bandana wrapped across his hairline.
"That's a tricky question. You see, when I found you, you were already in a state of snow madness, throwing off your clothes, blabbing about monsters, and running around in the nude."
He gestured over to the line of clothes drying near the stove.
"I had to knock you unconscious in order to wrap you in blankets and keep you warm. So, you've been out for a little more than a week, but I'm not sure if that was from the hypothermia or the knot on your head."
His smile faded to a grimace.
"Yeah, sorry about that."
Well, that explained the agony rippling through his brain. paradoxical undressing.
Indiga lifted a brow. I'm sorry?
Eric's mouth fell into a flat line.
It's called paradoxical undressing, where your brain tries to save you from hypothermia by flooding your body with blood. It makes people hallucinate and think they're hot when they're really not.
But a nagging in the back of his mind pulled his train of thought off the rails. If he had been out for a week, the multiverse should have collapsed into a singularity by now. That meant whatever Wilfred had done was successful at halting the runaway effects of his mistakes. But nothing had been undone. Billions of people were still dead, and the weight of his sins began to sink in on his soul.
Thanks again for saving me, but I really need to leave. There is so much left to fix.
Without thinking, he tried to force himself upright, and the large animal on top of him began furiously licking him once more.
Duck, get down!
Indiga snapped his fingers several times before the dog obeyed and slunk off to the corner of the tent, grumbling its dissatisfaction.
He's a good boy, but sometimes takes his job too seriously.
As he helped the other man sit up, he gave him a once-over. Parts of his body were still slightly pink, but the skin in those areas had begun to peel. A good sign.
Everything appears to be in working order, although I'm not a doctor. But I guess it's lucky my dog was able to bring up your body temperature.
He reached over to give the giant hound scritches behind his ears and began talking in a baby voice.
He's like a giant hot water bottle. Yes, he is. Yes, you are.
The frantically wagging tail nearly toppled the potbelly stove before Duck rolled over, asking boisterously for belly rubs.
I need to get out of here.
Eric closed his eyes, rubbing at his forehead. There was so much left to fix. He frowned. If his brother hadn't intervened, he might have actually caught the virus Wilfred had programmed in time. He could have quarantined the failsafe and actually opened a portal into the past to repair the damage. Anger bubbled up inside him. Why was Vel so damn meddling? He felt a shake on his shoulder that ripped him from his downward spiral, and he looked over to see Indiga gripping his arm.
What?
I said, sorry, but we won't be able to leave the hut for a few days. We're in the middle of a massive blizzard.
Eric groaned. That explained the rushing sound he had heard earlier.
I don't have time for this. I can't wait for weather. I need to get back to Ebra.
Indiga frowned.
Ebra? Yeah, that's not happening anytime soon. Unless you sprout wings. The ice bridge is broken up during the summer months and won't reform until winter.
Eric glanced towards the tent flap and the storm beyond it.
This is summer?
From what he had seen, the entire area had been covered in several feet of snow. Laughing, Indiga pulled himself towards the potbelly stove, shoving a poker into the flames. He shuffled the logs around several times before placing a cast-iron skillet on the flat cooking surface. A pleasant aroma of sizzling meat quickly filled the tiny space.
Trust me, it's a lot warmer than it looks. We wouldn't be above ground in winter. Besides, all the ice floes are breaking apart right now, making travel too dangerous.
He looked over his shoulder.
Why do you want to go to Ebra?
Rivaria is likely going to take over, and I have to get back to stop the mess I made.
Eric scratched at his head. How much damage could a newly resurrected deity cause? Indiga's light chuckle faded, and he stopped shaking the skillet, his voice losing its jovial tone.
Rivaria is dead. She has been for centuries.
He turned, scooting back to the half-elf to offer him a cup of water.
I think you might be dehydrated. Here.
Eric took the cup, carved from the horn of some sea beast, and drank in the crisp, clear liquid with greed. He slurped it up, ignoring the dribbles that ran down the sides of his mouth. He lowered it from his lips, slowing his breathing as he let the feeling of cool water rush through his system.
It's probably because we're so far north that the news hasn't reached you yet, but Rivaria has returned, brought back by the king. I have to get back and find a way to stop her.
His brain came to a jarring halt as he recalled that she was not the only new danger. Vel had been infected by Alpha, a mad deity in his own right.
Those are, mighty fine aspirations.
Indiga took the empty cup and refilled it before handing it back.
But I think you have more pressing concerns. We need to get you to the Island of Six Kings to see the healers.
I'm fine.
Eric brushed off the concern as he drained the cup once more, slowly this time, lest his stomach revolt at the sudden rehydration. But the water stopped at his lips. He was not fine. He had tried to kill his own brother, after everything he had done in the last 18 months to get back to the man. But if that damned idiot hadn't been so stubborn, none of this would have happened. If Elias hadn't succumbed to the siren's song of revenge, he would have made it back to the tower sooner. If anyone had chosen to listen to him or help him in the slightest, this entire catastrophe could have been erased. If Wilfred hadn't stabbed him in the back, if Wraith hadn't abandoned him. The cup slipped from his grasp, and it clattered to the ground as he remembered. Wraith had left him, leaving that tiny space in his shade empty. A cracking, hollow sound tore through his being as Eric struggled to shake the thoughts from his mind. Indiga scooted along the floor, wiping up the liquid with a rag before motioning to the half-elf's hands.
See? I told you. Not okay. You could very well lose those fingers to frostbite.
Frowning, Eric followed the Selkie's gesture. Darkest at the tips of his fingers and fading towards his wrists, his hands had gone black. He followed a trail of splotchy, peeling skin along his arms and pulled back the furs and blankets. He was very much naked beneath the covers, but he didn't care. He threw them all off to see the pink patches of skin continued along his body, leading down to several half-healed abrasions on his legs. His eyes widened to see that the balls of his feet and toes were in a similar, horrifying state as his hands. It was neither the damage to his body nor the chill of the air that caused Eric to drop the cup. The trembling he felt inside him and the tears burning his one eye were not from fear, but the realization he had lost the only person he believed would never leave him.
Come on, Miss Johnston. We need to take this patient outside for some sun therapy. Stat!
Atlas rolled his eyes at the absolute insult and injustice of this moment. He should have been the doctor. His acting was much more convincing. But before he could even mumble under his breath, he felt his teeth rattle as the gurney bounced out onto uneven cobblestones. He held on tight as he was jostled back and forth, the unforgiving metal wheels threatening to buck him off the moldy mattress. After several long minutes of feeling the gurney roll along bumpy cobblestones, he had just decided he wasn't going to lay there for another second when they came to a violent stop. If Atlas hadn't been holding on so tight to the railing, he would have slid right off the end. He felt a hand tap him several times, and he sat bolt upright.
This mattress was used. It better not be something contagious, or I'll make sure you both get it.
I'm happy to take you back inside and find a cleaner one for you.
Lucas waved a hand behind him.
Look, it was either this or Plan B, for break your other leg, which is what I would have had to do in order to keep that scary woman from hauling you away.
Groaning, Atlas glanced up and down the alleyway they had stopped in.
What took you so long?
He flung the musty blanket off him, swinging his uninjured leg over the edge of the gurney.
I've been under there all day!
Lucas tossed his hands up to shield his eyes, his face twisting in disgust.
For the love of Steve, will you please cover yourself up?
Retrieving his pack, he dug out a spare pair of jeans and flung them at the naked man.
Stop exaggerating. It was only 20 minutes. And just because I played the part of a doctor doesn't mean I actually know how to doctor someone up. I just set his broken nose and nearly blacked out from the sound of his screaming.
He shook away the surfacing memory.
It took me a few tries, and I ran out of gauze.
Oh, is that what all that wailing was about? I thought you parked me outside a maternity wing.
Atlas laughed as he kicked out his hardened cast with a wide smile, before practically bending himself in half to shove his toes into one leg of the pants.
So what's our next move? I don't want to find out why the Scholar or Ruby want to gain entry to the infernal realm.
He chewed on his lip for a moment before he added, with a grumble,
That place is a dump.
Look, I don't even know where we are. The last thing I remember was hiking through Big Bend National Park when I got caught up in this weird storm. And then, boom, I woke up in that hospital several days later.
Lucas had just settled on the idea of asking a local, a civilian, when he heard the rhythmic rush of boots headed down the cobblestone street that sat just behind them. Their alley wasn't exactly hidden, a bright lamppost sitting right at the entrance. He didn't feel safe here, and pushed past the others. He followed the curve of the wall and was pleased to see the exit of the alley led out to a different, perpendicular street. The silence was broken by the sound of squeaky wheels, and Lucas turned to see the robot pushing the Arcanist in his direction. The man was still nude, exposing himself to the gods and everyone in between. The pair of pants had gotten stuck halfway up the thick cast. He pinched the bridge of his nose, casting his gaze elsewhere.
Just put the damn gown back on.
Atlas scoffed, picking up the crumpled garment from beside him.
I don't want to wear this. It's unbecoming, and it will attract attention.
And I'm tired of looking at your tackle box.
Hey, I'll have you know that this,
Atlas gestured to all of himself,
is a blessing.
The Dryad narrowed his eyes until the Arcanist complied, shoving his arms into the thin medical gown. Mollified, Lucas turned, ready to lead the others out the exit, but froze when he heard a gravelly voice shout,
Damn it, Chester, lead with that next time,
from the top of the street. He tucked himself into the shadows, plastering his back against the wall and averting his face as he heard the sound of dozens of bodies rushing towards their little alley. Thankfully, they carried on, passing them by without notice. There was a tense moment where Lucas was sure his heart had stopped beating, certain they had been discovered, but the clamor of boots and shouts faded, leaving the street empty and their alleyway silent. Breathing again, he turned back to the others.
We just need a direction. Do either of you know the best way out?
Before Atlas could even shake his head, that blasted robot began speaking at length, but the pair of them could only make out certain words.
Turk zip haglot workshop ing eternal Atticus work wick exit.
Lucas reached up, scratching behind one of his horns.
I think this thing might know how to get us out of here, but it keeps calling you Atticus.
He looked over. Is that your name?
It's pronounced Atlas.
He turned to the robot.
Atlas.
Unit 2 gestured off in the opposite direction the crowd had gone, before returning his hands to the gurney and indicating that he was ready to lead.
Works for me.
Satisfied, Lucas snatched up his spare jeans from the man's leg, shoving them back into his bag, before a thought occurred to him and he flung them right back out. He hadn't checked fully the contents of his bag since waking up in the hospital.
I'm fairly certain the commotion has died down, so we can keep moving. I just need to check something.
He never broke his concentration from his digging until his fingers found what he was looking for. With a sigh of relief, he pulled out a small wooden box. He smiled as he pushed it against his chest in a loving manner before wrapping it up in one of his spare sweaters and returning it, and the rest of his things, back to the safety of his bag. Atlas spun, exposing his bare backside to the robot and the wider world. What was that all about? Lucas looked up. A bright, white smile cut across his face as he swung the knapsack over his shoulders.
I was just checking on my dad, making sure he was safe. He's all I got left in this world.
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
And then I throw open the door, and what do I see? 2 Twinkies and a metal nurse bot getting ready to do the devil's dance.
No,
What happened
that sounds
next?
awful.
Indeed. One of them was already stripped down like an automobile in a chop shop, tackle box out for the world to see. I tell you, ladies, I have never been so scandalized in all my years.
I grabbed one earlier this morning.
And that's not all. The deviant actually had the gall to invite me to join.
No, didn't.
You poor Of course
thing.
I threw them out of the room, not one to sully myself with such deeds, and immediately reported them to the authorities. But the sight, I'm afraid it shall haunt my dreams forevermore. You really should have said yes.
I know.
What was the robot for, though?